Today we're going to be talking about indentured servants, and we're going to be reading a few passages together, looking at some vocabulary, and then finally we're going to be looking at some questions that you're going to get the opportunity to answer. Okay, so let's get started. So here are some of the words that I want you to keep in your mind as we're going through the reading. Jamestown. What do you think that is? What does that sound like? Labor. Unskilled. Lodging. Restrictive. Acres. Treacherous. Freeman. Westward. Indigenous. Bacon's Rebellion. Prosper. Initially. Constant. And racial. Okay, so I want you to pause the video and take some time to jot down a couple notes about the words that you may already know about. If you know what any of these words already are, go ahead and write down a little definition so that you remember that as we're reading. For the words that you don't know, that's okay. The reading will hopefully help show you what those words might mean. So go ahead and pause the video, write down something, and then when you come back, we'll move on. Okay, I hope you pause the video. Let's go. Okay, so description. Take a look at the photo too, or the picture. What do you think this is showing us? Okay, let's get started. Indentured servants first arrived in America in the decade following the settlement of Jamestown by the Virginia Company in 1607. The idea of indentured servitude was born of a need for cheap labor. The earliest settlers soon realized that they had lots of land to care for, but no one to care for it. With passage to the colonies expensive for all but the wealthy, the Virginia Company developed the system of indentured servitude to attract workers. Indentured servants became vital to the colonial economy. The timing of the Virginia colony was ideal because Europe's economy was poor, and many skilled and unskilled laborers were without work. A new life in the New World offered a glimmer of hope. Servants typically worked 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage, room, board, lodging, and freedom eventually. Okay, so now that we've read this passage, take some time to think, what is it telling you? We know that it's a description, and we know this picture is telling us probably something important. I see one of our vocabulary words is in 2 places here. What do you think Jamestown is? Thinking about that, what do we think labor is? We know that it's next to cheap. The idea of indentured servitude was born of a need for cheap labor. What do you think labor is? Okay, and what do we think unskilled is? We know that many skilled and unskilled laborers were without work. What kind of people need work? We also see the word skilled next to unskilled. What do we know about the prefix un that can help us figure out what this word means? And lastly, lodging. Servants typically worked 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage, room, board, lodging, and freedom eventually. So what do we think lodging is? Okay, now that we've read this description, let's go on to the next passage. Life of an indentured servant. So before I start reading, think about what you think this passage is going to be about. If our title is Life of an Indentured Servant, what are we going to be reading about? What does the picture tell us? Let's get started. While the life of an indentured servant was harsh and restrictive, it wasn't slavery. There were laws that protected some of their rights, but their life was not an easy one, and the punishments given to people who wronged were harsher than those for non-servants. An indentured servant's contract could be extended as punishment for breaking a law, such as running away, or in the case of female servants, becoming pregnant. For those that survived the work and received their freedom package, many historians argue that they were better off than those new immigrants who came freely to the country. Their contract may have included at least 25 acres of land, a year's worth of corn, guns, a cow, and new clothes. Some servants did rise to become part of the colonial rich farmers, but for the majority of indentured servants that survived the treacherous journey by sea and the harsh conditions of life in the New World, satisfaction was a modest life as a freeman in a growing colonial economy. Okay, so as I read that, what were you thinking? What did you learn about indentured servants? What was their life like? And let's take a look at the vocabulary. What do you think harsh and restrictive means? What do we think acres mean? They got 25 acres of land. How about treacherous? They survived the treacherous journey by sea. What do you think that means? And lastly, a modest life as a freeman in a growing colonial economy. What does the word freeman make us think? Okay, so these are some important events. Remember to look at the picture. What is it telling us? Early in the century, some servants were able to gain their own land as freemen, but by 1660, much of the best land was claimed by the large landowners. The former servants were pushed westward, where the mountainous land was less farmable and the threat from indigenous people constant. A class of angry, poor pioneer farmers began to emerge as the 1600s grew old. In 1675 to 1676, Nathaniel Bacon led many poor white and black slaves and servants in a battle called Bacon's Rebellion. The British had to send a royal force to stop the uprising. This was a great fear of the rich farmers. What would prevent the poor from uniting to fight them? This fear hastened the transition to racial slavery. After Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, planters began to prefer permanent African slavery to the indentured servant system that had previously enabled them to prosper. Okay, so what did this passage tell us? What important events did we learn about? What do you think this picture's of after reading this? Okay, what do we think the word westward means? What word does it remind us of? Or mountainous, does that remind you of a word? What do we think indigenous means? We know that they're indigenous people. What about constant? The threat from indigenous people was constant. What do we think Bacon's Rebellion is? And lastly, what do we think it means to prosper? I want you to think, what replaced indentured servitude? What did we learn from this passage about how indentured servitude ended? Okay, so here are the lasting impacts. In 1619, the first Black Africans came to Virginia. With no slave laws in place, they were initially treated as indentured servants and given the same opportunities for eventual freedom as whites. However, slave laws were soon passed. In Massachusetts in 1641 and Virginia in 1661, and any small freedoms that may have existed for African Americans were taken away. As demands for labor grew, so did the cost of indentured servants. Many landowners also felt threatened by newly freed servants' demand for land. The colonial rich farmers realized the problems of indentured servitude. Landowners turned to African slaves as a cheaper and constant source of labor, and the shift from indentured servants to racial slavery had begun. So take a couple seconds to think about what the lasting impacts of indentured servitude were. What do you think this picture tells us as well? What are these people doing? What does it look like they're doing? Okay, so that was the last passage that we have to read, and the questions that we're going to answer using all of the passages we've read are these. When did indentured servants arrive in the Americas? What do you think the word labor means? What was included in the contract for indentured servants when their contract was over? Based on the phrase, the majority of indentured servants that survived the treacherous journey by sea, what does the word treacherous mean to you? And lastly, why did racial slavery start? So these are all questions that I want you to be thinking about. You can go back and look at the video, pause at different sections, read the text yourself. But I want you to answer these questions to get a better sense of what indentured servitude is. Okay, so good luck with that, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!